Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is another monthly reading wrap-up for the month of October. I read 4 books in the month of October, so I'm going to go through what I read, what I thought of them, all the stuff. Starting with the first book that I read Babel by R.F. Kuang. If you don't know what this book is, it is a historical fantasy. That's probably the best way to put it. But basically it's set, what's the time frame on this? In the early 1800s, and you are following these students at a college that is Babel. And basically it's one of the colleges at Oxford, and it is a institute of translation. And so the main character that you're following grew up in Canton, and he is basically brought over by this white guy to England to study at this translation institute because he has a native language other than English. And basically in this book, the magic system is that there are these silver bars, and the silver bars are powered by the essence that is lost in translation. So when you translate something from one language to another, and inevitably some of its meaning is lost, that meaning can then be used to power these silver bars so that they can then do different things depending on what words you're translating. So it's kind of confusing. I gave this book 4 stars. It was a little bit slow to get started. There's a lot of setup that is needed for this book. The magic system is kind of complicated. The setting up of this slightly altered Oxford is pretty complicated, but once you get about halfway, things really start to pick up, and then it goes pretty quick from there. So I spent a while in the first little bit, but once I hit about the halfway mark, I cruised through this pretty quickly. I thought that this did dark academia really well. I feel like I have a love-hate relationship with dark academia. I think the concept of the genre is super cool, but I haven't loved very many of the books that I've read in the genre. This one is definitely my favorite dark academia book I've ever read. The thing I loved the most about this book is that they actually take their studying seriously. And I feel like in dark academia books, a lot of what you have is these college students that supposedly got into this super prestigious university with a super prestigious program, and they're there on scholarship, and then they just drink and party and don't do anything else. And you're just like, at some point you need to do school. You're there on a scholarship. And so in this book, they're definitely much more how I picture like students who have gotten into a super prestigious college and are there on scholarship and need to earn their way through school, and they pour their heart and soul into their studies. It is their life, probably to the opposite extreme of what a lot of dark academia characters are, where those guys are out partying to the point that they're like unhealthy. These guys are studying to the point that it's highly unhealthy. But I really appreciated that that was more the focus of the book, was that they're so poured into their studies that they forget about life outside of the school, instead of it being that they are so drunk that they can barely even do their schoolwork. So that was one of my favorite parts about this book. I will say the ending is one of those kind of vague, you just get to kind of assume what happened endings, which I don't love. I really wish it would have told us how a few things turned out at the end of the book, and you just have to decide whether you think it was successful or not. And I don't love that, but other than that, I do think Babel is a really good book. If you are willing to push through the slow setup at the beginning, it is worth it. So that's Babel. I did quite enjoy it. After I finished Babel, I picked up something that was pretty much the complete opposite vibe, and that is The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England. And this is by Brandon Sanderson. This is one of his newest releases. Essentially, this book is about a guy who wakes up with no memories, and the handbook that is supposed to be his guide has been blown up in an explosion, and he finds out that he has landed himself in medieval England. He remembers enough about his life to know that he's from a more modern time period, and he's basically trying to go and explore medieval England, having no idea who he is or what is going on or what he's doing there. And so you kind of follow his journey as he tries to figure out who he is, as he then goes on all these adventures once he does start to remember who he is. And interspersed within it you get all these little funny snippets from the handbook. So you'll have like a chapter, and then at the end of the chapter there will be like a frequently asked questions page or like a sales pitch page and stuff like that. So this one is definitely more of a funny book, but I quite enjoyed it. I did give this book 4 stars. On reflection, I could probably bump it up a little bit. It's not quite a 5-star for me though. But I thought it was really fun. Unfortunately, this is one of the like Kickstarter ones, which means we're highly unlikely to get another book set in this world since it's not part of the Cosmere. But if you were looking to read a Brandon Sanderson book that wasn't like a super heavy fantasy like Mistborn and Warbreaker and some of those, this would be a really good intro to his writing if you wanted something that was much more lighthearted, fun. There's not a ton of world building. If you understand the basics of medieval England, you will get what's going on in this book. So, great intro to Brandon Sanderson book. Then the next book that I picked up was actually a reread for me, and that is The Haunted Mesa by Louis L'Amour. Louis L'Amour is actually a Western author, but this book is one of his mysteries. So it's kind of a mystery thriller somewhere in there. But essentially what it is, your main character is a ghost hunter. And so he like does TV shows and writes books and stuff, going and like debunking haunted houses and ghost stories and stuff like that. And he gets a phone call from his friend who is trying to build a house on the top of a mesa in, it's a little unclear if they're in Arizona or southern Utah, but somewhere down there on the southwest. And his friend basically says that he's in danger and he needs him to come. So he finishes up whatever project he's doing and then he goes down there. By the time he gets there, his friend has disappeared. And that's kind of the premise. So then he starts going around hunting, trying to figure out what was going on with his friend. And really his only clue is his friend's daybook that he like keeps a log of all of his stuff that he's doing. This book was originally a 5-star. So on my first read, I gave it a 5 stars. I loved it. On a reread, it's more like 3.5 stars. I just don't think that thrillers or mystery books are great rereads. I thought I'd forgotten. It's been a long time since I've read this book, and so I thought I'd forgotten enough that I could read it and still be surprised about stuff. I remembered a lot more than I thought about this book. The first part, again, is really slow. Until you hit about page 300, it's kind of slow, but also I feel like if you didn't know what was happening, there's enough information that you're finding out that's surprising that if this was your first time through, it would be interesting, it wouldn't be so slow. But remembering which characters end up being bad made the first part go really slow because I already knew how I was going to end up. And so that kind of killed the first part. There's also, once you hit about page 300, 350, you get to where things really pick up and they kind of take a turn in the plot. And there's something that happens that I can't really talk about without super spoiling it. But in my mind, having memories of this book, that was a huge part of the book. And it is just like a major part of the plot. That's where a lot of the reveals are. Like any thriller or mystery, the last 100 pages is where you get all the answers. But in my mind, that was a lot more of the book. So I was just waiting the whole time for when we got to that point. And it was a lot further in than I thought. So I think that was part of my issue, is that I just knew what was coming and I wanted to get to the answer, fun, exciting part. And so getting through all of the information buildup was really slow on the second time around. So I do think that still stand by that this is a good book, especially if you want a more supernatural but not super freaky book. Like, it's not creepy, but it is like a supernatural thriller book. So this one's a fun one. If you are okay with a little bit of slowness, but again, the first time I read it, I don't remember feeling like it was slow. So it's just maybe a book that you should read once and not reread. And then the last book that I read actually wasn't on my TBR. So if you watched my September wrap up that had my October TBR in it, I also had And then there were 4 and Frankenstein on my TBR, but I didn't get to either of those books this month. I was just super in the mood for a like vampire type book, and sort of like a Halloween monsters type book, but not Frankenstein. I wasn't quite feeling like that kind of monster, so I went to the Barnes & Noble and I wandered around for so long trying to find a book that I liked. And I pretty much picked this book purely off the cover and then some light Googling to see if it was something I'd be interested in. But that is The Lights of Prague by Nicole Jarvis. This book is essentially, it's set in Prague, I want to say also in the 1800s or something like that. It's not like old Prague. And there are these creatures that are somewhat like vampires. They're called pijavikas? Pijavis? Something like that. Don't know how to say it. And they roam the streets. They're vampire-esque. They're a little more freaky than vampires, in my opinion. More monstery than kind of our common vampires. And then you also have the lamplighters who go around and light the lamps at night. But unbeknownst to most of humanity, the lamplighters are also the monster fighters, and so they fight the vampire creatures. And so you're following Domik, who is one of the lamplighters, as he's going about it. And then you also there's kind of a romance that goes on in the book with this widow who is this like super rich lady who has all sorts of secrets. And then you also have several other kind of creatures. So you have a ghost that is following him around, you have a will-o'-the-wisp. Those are kind of the main characters. So you have like the humans, the vampire Pijavis things, and then you have will-o'-the-wisp and ghost. And so you're basically following his adventures as he starts to uncover this big scheme that's going on amongst the monster underground in Prague. This book gets right to it. The action starts from page 1. His very first thing is a fight scene, and I felt like it kept the pace pretty fast throughout the whole book. I did give this one 4.5, so not quite a 5-star. There were a couple things that kind of brought it down for me. One of which is the internet claims that this is a fade to black book, and there's really not that much romance and there's not that much spice, but there is one scene that I would say is a little further than just a fade to black. If you are someone who, like me, likes to avoid those, you can kind of see it coming. There's like a paragraph break on page 214, and then it continues through 215 down to the bottom of 216. So from like the bottom of 214 to the bottom of 216, if you don't love spice, you could just skip that. It doesn't ruin anything, really. You don't miss anything. That's the one scene that just was enough to bring it down from a 5-star for me. Otherwise, like aside from that, the plot is really good. There's lots of fun twists, and I feel like it was action-packed the whole way through. I'm not a huge romance lover, but I don't feel like that sidetracked from it too much. I actually think that that was fine in this book. So I would highly recommend, if you're looking for a good Halloween book, this would be the perfect book. Again, that's The Lights of Prague. Okay, these are all of the books that I read in October. Now I'm going to quickly go over my TBR for November. So I picked 4 books for my TBR for November. I might get to more than that, I don't know. These are just kind of the books that I was feeling like reading for the month. I also, on Black Friday, am probably going to be doing some book shopping because you might as well when there's good deals going, so we'll see. I might find a book then that I end up wanting to read, so I didn't want to overload myself on my TBR for this month. But first one that I want to read is The Children of Virtue and Vengeance by Tomi Adeyemi. I really need to figure out exactly how you say her name. Adeyemi? Something like that. This is book 2 in the Children of Orisha series. The first one is called Children of Blood and Bone, and I read that one, when would it have been? Over the summer. Maybe I finished it in August. I think that might have been when I read it. But essentially what this series is it's a fantasy series where basically it's kind of like a fantastical version of Western Africa. I think it's sort of based off of Nigeria, but they are living in a land where there used to be magic, but then the king came in and basically eradicated magic. And then our main character, Zayli, gets the chance to bring magic back. And so you're following her journey to try and outrun the king and the prince to try and save magic and bring it back for her people. I can't say too much more than that without spoiling things. This is book 2 of a series. This is going to be a trilogy. It's not complete yet. The 3rd book comes out next June. So I've decided to just go ahead and read them. Then I'll know for sure if I want to read the 3rd one, which I'm guessing I will, and I'll just reread them when I get to that point that I'm ready to read the 3rd book. So this is probably the book I'm going to start with next. And then the next book on my list is Shadow and Bone. This is the first book in the Grishaverse. I've heard a lot of mixed reviews on whether people think this is a great book or not worth reading. A lot of people skip the Shadow and Bone trilogy and just go straight to Six of Crows, but I personally just cannot bring myself to do that. So I'm going to read Shadow and Bone first. I really honestly don't even know that much about the plot of this. I know it's fantasy, I think it's YA. That's about as much as I know. But I found at Costco over the summer a box set of this trilogy and the Crooked Kingdom duology, and it was super cheap, so I just got it. But I think that this would be a fun fantasy to pick up in November. And then the next one is Inferno by Dan Brown. This is the 4th book in the Robert Langdon series. I don't know if that's what it's actually called, but that's what I'm choosing to call it because I don't know what else to call it. The most popular book is the Da Vinci Code, but that's not actually the first book, so I don't know what they call the series. This one is basically just continuing it. I don't even know. It looks like this one happens in Italy. Basically, all of these books follow a professor who is a religious symbology professor, and he gets brought in on all of these like murder cases to try and solve them when they're related to like religious symbolism. So that's about as much as I know about this one. I've liked the series so far, so I'm ready to continue it. And then the last book on my TBR is also another series that I'm in the middle of, and this is Xenocide by Orson Scott Card. This is book 3 in the Ender's Game series, which is part of the overall Ender's verse, but this one is like directly following Ender's Game. So I really can't say much about this. It's sci-fi, but this is book 3 in a series, so there's just not much to say. But I would like to continue the series. It does also sound like this one leaves off on a cliffhanger, so I may have to go straight into the next book, but we'll see how I'm feeling at the end of this. Alright, I kind of sped through the TBR there, but lots of these are further into a series, so I really can't say much about them without spoiling them. But I hope you enjoyed this wrap-up and TBR video. If you have read any of these books and have thoughts, I would love to know what your thoughts are on these books or any other books that you would recommend that I read based off of which ones I like. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.